So thank you all for your patience and welcome to those who are just joining us. My name is Katie Fleming. I'm the Education Coordinator at the Phoebe Ahurst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you all here today. And I'm just going to change our view here real quick. Thrilled to welcome you all here today and to present today's program, From the Throat, Women's Textile Work and Memories of Disaster in Bangladesh, and our speaker, Pulomi Saha. Thank you so much for being here, Pulomi.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted.
So, I'm sorry, I think you all are still seeing my video as spotlit. I'm going to try and remove that real quick. There we go. So this program is part of a series presented alongside the current online exhibit at the Hearst Museum entitled Cloth That Stretches, Weaving Community Across Time and Space, which explores clothing and textiles as sites of identity formation, resilience, and resistance. And today we have the great pleasure of hearing from Pulomi Saha, who's the Associate Professor of English at the University of California, Berkeley. She's affiliated faculty in the programs in Critical Theory and Gender and Women's Studies and teaches courses in Post-Colonial Studies, Gender and Sexuality Theory, and Ethnic American Literature. Her first book, An Empire of Touch, Women's Political Labor and the Fabrication of East Bengal, which we'll be linking to in the chat for more information, was awarded the Harry Levin Prize for Outstanding First Book by the American Comparative Literature Association in 2020, and the Helen Tarter First Book Subvention Prize in 2017. So congratulations for those accolades, and thank you so much for being here today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started with today's program.
Great. I'm so delighted to be here. I will give everyone the warning that despite the fact that I've been teaching on Zoom for a semester and a half, I am still a Luddite disaster. So I'm going to do the very best I can with the technology at hand. And I hope that no disasters will befall us today. So this talk draws from my first book, An Empire of Touch, which offers an account of women's political labor in East Bengal, which is present-day Bangladesh, for over more than a century. And it suggests a way to think about textiles and the gendered laboring they're making. This book follows the historical traces of women who've claimed their labor, taking what was merely seen as intimate and domestic and turning them into appreciable political acts. Following the widespread and systematic rape of women during the Bangladesh War of Independence in 1971, the new Bangladesh government established a rehabilitation program aimed at women who had either been simply displaced during the war or, having been subject to sexual violence, were unable or unwilling to return to their families. Efforts were aimed at providing women useful skills so they might enter into a condition of economic productivity, as well as psychological and occupational therapy. Today, I want to talk about one particularly local, deeply textured in both meaning and form, kind of textile work that was taken up not just in the rehabilitation centers, but which has a long history in Bengal as a site of women's articulation. Textile through which women speak their hopes, their desires, their politics, and their memories. Part 1. Scraps of Sari. Malika Khan, inspired by her training as a social worker and as a lifelong Girl Guide to help in the rehabilitation efforts in the days following the end of the war in 1971, recalls traveling through Dhaka, tracking rumors of women being held in makeshift encampments either by Pakistani armies or by local collaborators. Having heard throughout the war of women and girls being taken from their homes or separated from their families as they fled, and of the whispers of what was being done to them, rape, torture, imprisonment, Khan and other volunteers anticipated what they might find. Ranging from the prepubescent to the elderly, the women came from across Bangladesh. They were middle class and poor, rural and urban, Hindu and Muslim. They were often moved from encampment to encampment, their captors dogged by the Mukti Bahini forces. By the end of the war, some of them had been held for months. When Khan, accompanied by one or two Mukti Bahini for protection, would hear, usually from a rickshawala or others whose manual labor rendered them mobile in the city, of a locked room or a guard enclosure from which the sound of crying escaped, or the sight of a woman was glimpsed, she would go armed with little but her own cotton saris and her commitment to a Girl Guide oath to serve country and help others. She says, "We did not know what we would find there. We did not know the need. I would bring my old cotton saris and rip them into pieces. I couldn't offer them a whole sari, but I would wrap the pieces around them to cover their bodies as we took them out. Those saris, worn, soft with age and use, were the first thing that the women and girls rescued would wear on their bodies. It was the touch of her cloth, bearing the traces of her body, that was the first touch of safety for these women and the bridge to care in an outside world in which a newly independent nation awaited. For these women who had been confined to spaces of touch that intended to offer no comfort, some of whom had been continually raped for a year, the contact with cloth as familiar as Khan's cotton sari was an encounter with the past of their own familial lives. It was the touch of a Bengali woman like them. Khan's saris and her presence ruptured the container of the camp as a circumscribed space of violence and subjugation. In handing out the strips of cloth that once lay upon her own body, Khan reoriented the bodies of these women away from the practices of their imprisonment and towards a simple task of getting dressed. This act recalls one of the earliest embodied practices of Bengali womanhood, learning to drape a sari. It is the muscle memory of a matrilineal world. And so a kinship emerges between Khan and these women, their bodies bound together by the local textile of Bengali cotton, or tat. Tat saris are instantly geographically recognizable. Currently in the background, you have an image of a 19th century muslin sari, which is the historical forebearer of the tat. This is an artisanal fabric that you see, but tat, which becomes its ubiquitous descendant, is woven only in Bengal. And the nearly translucent cotton is named for the word loom. It's stiffened with starch to give it enough body to be dyed and ornamented. Over time then, the repeated washings of the sari, the fiber loosens and yields a fabric that clings softly to the body. Tat is an intimate technology. Produced on hand looms of thread spun from reused cotton scraps, tat emerges from the body of women who spin, cut, and starch it. Unlike its artisanal cousin, the muslin you see here, with whom it shares a basic technology, tat is egalitarian. It is cheap enough that even the poorest woman can afford it and durable enough to last her lifetime. And here, this is, as I was writing this book, I came across this remarkable scientific study about tat. I had not realized for all of the use of tat that tat was actually also a life-giving fabric. For many years, women used old tat saris folded repeatedly as water filters. This filtration method was actually remarkably effective, and it worked against cholera up to 99%. However, as cotton quality declined, and in fact, the indigenous form of cotton leaves Bengal and is replaced by an imported American cotton, the rates of cholera spike. And this newer, looser weave of cotton, which became valued in the commercial market because it was immediately soft, unlike the original forebearer, no longer had the structure to filter out plankton and bacteria. So you see, as cheap commodity tat enters the market, a rise in cholera, a need for more intervention from the state, and also a loss of this kind of intimate technological work that women's fabric did. So then, as a prize material signifier of Bengal, beloved as much for its beauty as its ubiquity, the touch of the tat fabric is the touch of a particularly Bengali, markedly feminine form of textile. The scraps of her own sari that Malika Khan drapes on the body of women makes between them a kind of tactile kinship that will also mark the rehabilitation program. Much of the initial handicraft work at the rehabilitation center was the occupational therapy of intimate muscle memory. Women were encouraged to share family practices, those that were so instinctive that they defied the limits of language, to reproduce memories of homes to which they may not return in resurgent forms of embroidery patterns, recipes, and figural designs. Occupational therapy at the rehabilitation center sought to reorient them to this new world by recalling to them an old one. The decree by the Bangladeshi first president Sheikh Mujib that women raped during 1971 be called bironganas, war heroines, and offered compensation for their war labor, compresses sexual violence and military heroism into a single vision of a recuperative national femininity that is valorized and sanitized. The word birongana, from bir meaning heroic, can either mean heroine or hero's wife. This double connotation echoes the work of the rehabilitation centers to simultaneously shift women out of the camps back into the domestic sphere, going so far as to offer dowries for men to marry them, and or into the realm of economic productivity. Women were given vocational training in clerical and technical fields. The state recognized that there'd be high demand for this in the coming years, but the focus on artisanal craft, particularly textile work, engage an aesthetic and cultural economy of valuable labor. This image that you see is a photo taken by Jill Sabella, an American photographer at the rehabilitation camps. And here you have a group of women who are being trained in using Singer sewing machines. So they are being trained potentially to enter into all kinds of both large scale and small scale economic activity. BRAC, which is today the world's largest NGO with programs in 12 countries, began with a relatively local project of small-scale relief for returning war refugees. As the central government of Bangladesh struggled to provide for the millions of displaced Bangladeshis, BRAC stepped in to offer civil services like medical centers, infrastructural repair, and home building. In 1978, Aisha Abed, wife of BRAC's founder, Sir Fazle Abed, set up Arong as BRAC's private handicraft retail chain. It continues to this day to source much of its product from women's collectives that were established in this early period of the nation. The name Arong, which comes from the Bengali market fair, references the cultural memory of the local Mela, which are temporary fairs that were set up in villages to celebrate festivals, in which local artisans would sell their goods, terracotta sculptures, woven cloth, wood carvings, and embroidery. As a commercial venture in Dhaka, Arong set out to remind an urban elite of that prior art and manufacture and to hone a revived patriotic aesthetics. A revival of Bengali art and craft was central to a broad nationalist project in the post-war years. To shop at Arong, which engages in nominally fair trade practices, was to announce yourself a steward of Bengali culture. Similarly, to support the work of the women who were trained through these endeavors was to associate yourself to the project of removing the stigma of sexual violence through a kind of shared touch. When the handicraft of women by women at the center was sold through places like Arong, they circulated through this new nation as material remains of a violence of the war and its afterlife. In particular, textile training knit together valorized objects of Bengali manufacture, material reference of a prior prosperity and aesthetics, with new rituals of care and contact. Especially fabric, which is itself so very porous, comes to be suffused with the particles of flesh and of recollection, drawing together a new national body. Like the handloom cotton that Gandhi in the 1930s thought in India would weave together a common national body, these handicrafts made in the early Republic of Bangladesh also hoped to bind together a new Bangladeshi body, while at the same time wanting very much to disappear the site of violence that these women faced. 2, from the throat. One form of stitching to which these women insistently returned was the local Nakshikata, embroidered quilts that are archetypal of a feminized folk aesthetic. They're made of scraps of discarded fabric from the body, cotton saris, like the Tat saris that we talked about earlier, lungis, dhotis, and these old fabrics are pressed into one another and then sutured together. Gathas give new life to a material worn soft with age and touch. Even the thread of Gatha embroidery is traditionally pulled from old saris, making it a form of artistic labor available to women across socioeconomic difference, a shared practice of textile work that warmed the body with the reborn remnants of familiar cloth. You see here an image of a 19th century Gatha. Because Gatha consisted of the most pedestrian and ubiquitous materials, they're also a democratic and commonplace form of art that nonetheless demand rigorous training and detail. And this you can see in the close-up just how intricate these stitches are. These familiar worn textiles attend the lives of Bengalis, from the blankets in which infants are swaddled at birth, to family bedspreads, to ceremonial puja mats, to Quran covers. Textures of contact and care are woven into the gatha with elaborately stitched designs that illustrate a deeply local sense of home and place, condensing the memory of touch into an intimate fabric. For young women who sewed gathas for their trousseaux, the gatha wasn't just proof of their marriageability, but also the material trace of their families that could travel with them to their new lives and homes with their in-laws. In the materiality of the gatha, we find a particularly rich gathering of corporeal intimacy, aesthetic training, and affective possibility. American art historian Stella Kramrich was an early proponent of gathas as fine rather than folk art. She built over decades an extensive collection of gathas, determined to preserve and publicize the exquisite art that had been relegated to mundane and domestic because it seemed to have been made by ordinary women. She writes, the gathas of East Bengal are saturated with and express a numinous power, the Shakti of the region, working through its women and given form by innumerable disciplined stitches. I want to show you now some of the gathas of the Kramrich collection housed today at the Philadelphia Museum of Art to help give you a sense of the richness of the detail, the fineness of the museum, the fineness of the work, the precision of the manufacture made by these quilts that were made entirely of common objects by apparently common women. Nakshikatas announce their location with motifs and designs particular to Bengal, though the Gatha tradition exists throughout the subcontinent, particularly in the north. Nakshi, from the Persian naksh, means figuralism, the embroidered design that binds together the layers of fabric and renders them anew. Gatha, however, has a slightly less certain etymology, and I am a sucker for etymology. I think that often we can answer almost every question of meaning by turning to the word. It has commonly been linked to the Bangla khet for field. Khetha is a vernacular word for a simple stitched coverlet used by the rural poor, and to the Sanskrit kantha for rags, which are reconstituted in the form of the quilt. Indeed, these are the material kin of the gatha, but its symbolic force might be best understood through the underexplored, or maybe even unexplored, linguistic affinity to the Sanskrit kantho for throat. The seat of utterance, the seat of utterance, the throat gives rise to kotha, to speech and to story. Gathas are vehicles then of speech, the utterances of material labor and continual contact, the discourse of design for women who exclusively make them. These are intensely personal art objects, the content and composition of which are entirely in the hands of women. Within the home, through the routinization of stitch and touch, women attach their personal narratives and artistic visions to the fabric of familial cloth. From the throat, then, gathas tell the stories of women who make them and bear the traces of their labor and investment. Gathas often depict the most intimate aspects of life. A textural space opens up a vast terrain of possibility, unregulated by public demands or family oversight. In the 19th century, as more women developed basic literacy, Gatha designs like this one come to include names, aphorisms, and verse. This one you can see on the side, oh, I can't point. It says, Bemol Gamini, which is likely the name of the woman who made this gatha. You also see, following the 1905 partition of Bengal and the rise of Bengali nationalism, patriotic phrases start to pop up as they begin to the world seeps into these intimate fabrics, where the sphere of politics, which would seem so far afield, especially from the hands of rural women, suddenly appears in the objects of their making. Gathas are in this way spaces of articulation, imagination, and self-conception for women that are both deeply personal and also relentlessly social. Their use is never limited to the women who produce them. They bind together bodies and attentions through accumulated touch. In 1939, Stella Kramrisch writes, "It takes from 6 months to 3 generations to make a single gatha. No commercial incentive accelerates or vitiates the process of making a whole out of discarded, worthless bits. They are joined and reinforced by innumerable small stitches, which give to the ground with its figures a new life and a new ageless meaning." And I want to now, with this gatha, show you through my rather hand-handed technology and zoom how very detailed this work is. So I'm going to zoom into the bottom center of this gatha, in which you can see the tiny stitches that are part of this much broader, intricate tapestry. This is incredibly difficult, time-consuming work. A gatha like this probably would have taken a woman between 6 months to 2 years to make. This is in between her regular domestic work, her other responsibilities, but these are objects so suffused with the material labor of women and with their artistic vision. However, today in Bangladesh, Nakshikatas have become consumer goods, not familial ones, though they are also that. Sold through the handicraft NGO sector and largely shorn of their original functions as artifacts of familial care and contact, the new life of the Nakshikata is synchronized to the new life of the Bangladeshi nation. Its revival as a valued art form is sponsored by NGO apparatuses like BRAC. BRAC's post-war commitment to the revival of handicrafts was about drawing the rural poor into economic possibility. Here you see a handmade gatha sari, but this is actually tens of thousands of dhaka. It's quite an expensive piece, but it was produced entirely for a commercial market. The formerly familial practices of women can also be resurrected with relatively low cost and training. It could draw women into a workforce as makers of this markedly Bangladeshi object. What was once deeply personal and insistently irreproducible, a site of women's articulation, their personal kotha, that is their words, has now been transformed into the representative technology of a new national imagination. So what happens when this intimate practice is commercialized into a commodity? These gatha designs are shorn from the utility of their origins, blankets, coverlets, and are now produced not out of multi-layers of worn cloth familiar from the body, but actually on a new single layer of cotton cloth. All trace of the used and worn and embodied is lifted from the threads of the gatha. Its new artifice is the romantic pastoral image of a Bengal frozen in time. Arong, for example, markets a broad range of gatha stitch products, from saris to tablecloths to wall hangings. The decorative hangings, which you see here, especially betray the transformation of the gatha practice into commodity. They eschew the geometric and iconic structure of the traditional gatha in favor of these highly figural scenes of Bangladeshi peasants, thatched huts, teeming rivers. The neo-pastoral imagination figured in the gatha hangings now stands in as a representative of real Bengal, returned in form and in technology to a prior way of life. If these gatha stitch figural hangings that you can buy in Dhaka now circulate within an upwardly mobile and urban Bangladeshi population, bringing the rural and authentic Bengal to an increasingly globalized city like Dhaka, right? You buy these at Arong in Dhaka and you would pay a lot of money for them. Another incarnation of this art form actually travels globally through the NGO market, supported by the Mennonite Central Committee. Several NGOs in Bangladesh focus on fair trade gatha work as a vehicle of the general project of women's empowerment. Now, in my book, I have, I think, a pretty vicious takedown of women's empowerment that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But for now, I will say that this project has become maybe one of the most visible sites of Bengal and of Bangladesh and Bangladeshi women's labor in a global marketplace. For example, collectives like this is Rishilpi or the Sacred Mark distribute gatha stitched throws and bags through the MCC global retail outpost, 10,000 villages, or perhaps you're thinking about shopping for a loved one for Christmas this year, right? This group, like all of the MCC groups in Bangladesh, place a premium on the promise of uplift and opportunity. This image is, I think, iconic. Dream big pillow that you can get as a repurposed cotton sari done with gatha stitch. Sacred Mark, however, which is one of the major groups that MCC supports, doesn't just do the work of moving women into the fair trade, but does so with a distinct focus of supporting women who've left sex work in Dhaka's red light district. Evoking without citing the projects of handicraft therapy offered to women raped during the war in 1971, Sacred Mark endorses a markedly neoliberal and moralizing agenda. Using single-layer sari scraps to recall traditional gatha work, Sacred Mark's products stitch together not just the memory of domestic life and its somatic traces, but the purifying potential of touch. Here again, we see Gandhi, who believed that in making handloom fabric, you could in fact purify the body who produced that fabric. This purifying potential of touch is deeply powerful as an image, and therefore it's probably not surprising that the other good that Sacred Mark manufactures is soap. Each bar of soap produced by Sacred Mark is impressed with the thumbprint of the woman who made it, the mark of the saved, which is cast here as a mark of the sacred. Sacred Mark's gathas bear on their form the promise of purchasing a kind of corporeal, a bodily intimacy with the bodies whose labors had been moved away from the realm of the shameful, right? And this is the language of sex work is bad and shameful, to the valorized, fair trade, textile work is valorized. Recalling the material histories of gathas as intimate sites of comfort and contact between women and their beloveds, this fair trade model monetizes one set of labor practices while condemning both sex work and, we'll talk about this in a second, garments work as exploitative. Fair trade's focus on direct supply lines produces a fantasy that the physical distance between artisan and consumer can be bridged by the material promise of shared touch and the ideological promise of progress. Buying handmade products from female artisans in the global South conveys an intimacy between those who are willing and able to pay a premium and those whom they believe will directly benefit from it. Handmade connotes contact, implies familiarity, it bears the touch. That bodily trace of the artisan that attaches to the object is circulated through the fair trade model, here undiluted by multinational supply chains, and it arrives in the hand of the consumer to bind them to the development project. Sacred Mark's marketing espouses a now familiar neoliberal credo to buy the change you wish to see in the world. Transnational commerce is thus personalized and sentimentalized, engaging an affective economy of sympathy and altruism, Consumers of the fair trade model imagined themselves as purchasing a life for the artisan that they themselves might be willing to live. 3. Memory work. Once called an international basket case, Bangladesh, which has received more than $60 billion of foreign aid since 1971, has been a laboratory of development indices and global aid policy. These gender-targeted policies and programs have been credited with Bangladesh's recent rise through the Human Development Indices. But the true vehicle of Bangladesh's economic progress has been the fabric produced by contemporary garments labor, the object of international scrutiny after a series of catastrophic factory incidences. Unlike the fair trade handmade textile work that also circulates internationally, garment work's alleged distance from the touch of the human hand, its industrialized and mechanized anonymity, is precisely what quantifies its labor value so inexpensively as to ensure that Bangladeshi-made garments are profitable as a transnational commodity. The very name ready-made garment promises that a machine, not a human, manufactures the clothing and suggests a kind of magical process by which the garment pre-exists itself, ready-made. Ready-made is, of course, it should be clear, a misnomer. Those cotton shirts that bear the tag made in Bangladesh bear the bodily traces of a highly physical and even exertional manufacture. Blood, dust, spit, sweat from workers are embedded in the tight, regular knit weave. Though the process promises mechanization, much of the work is actually done by hand. From grading to marking to spreading to cutting to sewing to finishing, each step of the manufacture engages the body of the worker. The industrial machines that are purchased from Korea and China are often ill-suited to the physical spaces of the factories. When they break, replacement parts have to be supplemented by ad hoc measures. So often you'll find that if a pulley breaks, rather than replacing the rubber of a pulley, people actually use sari fabric. As a result, what in the model of the industry is an almost entirely mechanized process is in reality largely manual. These textiles too are handmade. In April 2018, to mark the 5th anniversary of the Rana Plaza disaster, in which more than 1,100 garment workers were killed, the Bangladesh Garment Workers Solidarity Organization mounted an exhibit in front of the 9-story structure, where the 9-story structure once perilously stood. Wild marshes and water hyacinth have long taken over the building footprint, a testament to the pond on which the haphazard construction had taken place. The dogged fertility of this soil that had been so valued by the British Empire has covered up the remaining concrete and rebar wreckage. A dozen or so quilts were draped over bamboo stalks next to hung shirts and salwars in front of the memorial monument, a pair of hands rising out of the ground, fisting a hammer and sickle. These gathas were stitched by family members of workers who died in Rana Plaza. Each gatha on display at the Sriti Gatha or O Gatha, the Sriti Gatha O Gatha, that is Memorial Quilts and Remembrances, exhibit is a testament to the private grief of those whose loved ones became tokens of a kind of global outrage. Their deaths on a global scale were abstracted evidence of corporate and state failing. Although they are displayed in memories of workers killed while manufacturing industrial cotton, these gathas, like gathas that have been made by Bengali women for generations, are made of intimate fabrics, personal cloth worn soft with use, embroidered together with individual icons of care. Unlike the tightly woven cloth that their loved ones measured, spread, cut, seamed, pressed, and finished, the structure of these intimate cloths, these saris from which the gathas are made, is loosened, permeated by the repeated contact with skin and water and dirt and sun. They're embedded with the bodily traces of intimate care and recalled loss. Sriti Gatha Gatha or Gotha. I'm going to keep mixing these words up because they are homophonic, right? So Sriti Gatha or Gotha, while deeply local to the wreckage of Rana Plaza and to the form of the Bengali Nakshikata, comes out of a global kinship of remembrance. In 2011, marking the centenary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York, American artist and activist Robin Burson began to work on the Workers' Memorial Quilt Project. She collaborated with quilters guilds and students at FIT in New York to construct a quilt in the American folk tradition, consisting of individual squares patched together. The quilt blocks feature images of workers killed in the fire, with their names and ages culled from archival sources, printed labor songs and slogans, and quotes from notable Americans. The form of the Sriti Gatha or Gotha Gathas clearly draws inspirational from this memorial quilt, notably the inclusion of images of workers who've died. This is a feature that's not endemic to Gathas, and indeed is engaged in an internationalist commitment. But these textiles, first hung at the site of the loss they recall, and then displayed for an urban public in Dhaka, are memory work of a different order, of another materiality. The memory function of the Gathas here recalls the somatic and social life of intimacy. Peter Stalabras writes of the wrinkle as material memory. He says, those wrinkles recorded the body that inhabited the garment. They memorize the interaction, the mutual constitution of person and thing. Indeed, in the 19th century, memory was the technical term for tailors for the wrinkles in clothing. These gathas record the presence of that which remains, those who remain, as well as the inhabitation of those who are lost and loss itself. Killed by the very structure of their labor, the Rana Plaza workers for whom there are gathas have come into new use. Their deaths are a convenient, though perhaps necessary, proof of the failure of adequate safety, compensation, conditions of work and life for a global and local audience. The calls for reform and reparation accompany the conditional so that their deaths are not in vain. Their labor is made meaningful in the light of their death, in the absence of them as living actors. For their loved ones, however, those who labor at the making of gathas in their memory, there is no affective, political, or financial remuneration for their loss. When they beseech an audience not to forget the names and faces of their loved ones, the gatha stitchers do not cite death as that which gives them meaning. These gathas are relics of personal loss. They recall life, not death. They memorialize the ongoing social relations in which these workers, named and pictured, continue to exist in everyday, mundane life. This daily, somatic, laboring existence that wore soft the saris from which the gathas were stitched, the tactile, accumulative contact of bodies and cloth, adhering remains on top of remains. Nasima Begum, whose daughter Aki was killed at Rana Plaza, says, while I made my gatha, I remembered my daughter. With my pain, with my daughter's memory, with her essence, I thought of my child with every letter I stitched. The touch of memory here is not a metaphor. It's not an abstraction. Nasima Begum insists with the corporeal traces of her own body and the memory of her daughter's body on her, near her, imbued into the weave of the cloth. Stella Kramrisch, one more time, says that the material of gathas are rags and their threads. Joined afresh, these tatters are given new wholeness. The gatha is a work that gives wholeness to things that were of no use anymore, to fragments without significance. The gathas of this exhibit can no more make whole the losses expressed within them than they can bring back to life those who were killed. Nonetheless, the work of their manufacture is the embodied, tactile articulation that insists on the significance and the necessity of the people who died. Their work may have been undervalued, and their deaths may be reappropriated, but the intimate touch of cloth to hand, There, their relational lives and desires abide. In the form of the gatha, the memory trace of work is inextricable from care, where what is recalled by the wrinkles in cloth is the touch of bodies at work and at rest. Thank you. So I'm going to unshare my screen, and I am happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'm delighted to talk about whatever may be interesting to you at this moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I have to acknowledge what a beautifully poetic presentation that was. I mean, you mentioned at the end this bringing together fragments into a whole, and I feel like you just really did that for so many of us today who may not have been familiar with so many pieces of this story coming together in this really beautiful narrative. So I want to let our audience today know that the chat is now open. You can chat publicly or feel free to send questions privately directly to me, and I'd love to pose them to Palomi. I have some questions or ideas that have been sticking with me to get the conversation started. I kind of wanted to go back to what you spoke about in the very beginning of your talk today about this unforeseen benefit of textile and this fascinating story that you mentioned about cholera and the textile being used as a water filtration device. And it makes me think of all the dangers that we see after the fact of this reductionism of craft or of idea, just thinking that you can pluck an idea or an item or a traditional practice and replace it or reform it somewhere else with all the same benefits or change something in the formula. And I'm curious to hear either more about this particular story or whether you can think of any other of these examples of unforeseen benefits that detail is lost when it's removed or replaced, or anything else that brings up for you.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about that story is that the reason that you lose this filtration power is because you have a demand for a cheap commodity, right? That is ubiquitous and relatively cheap compared to more artisanal fabrics. But with the importation of this American short staple cotton, which grows faster. It's not indigenous to Bengal, but it was imported, it grows faster. And it seemed to produce a fabric that would be more available to the poor, right? There's a positive benefit. It's just that no one had understood the insistence of, or the long life of this fabric in its various forms, right? When people think about the use of a fabric, we often think about it in terms of when you wear a garment and then you discard it. The reuse is often what gets lost. And so the fact that women were reusing these garments as filtration, I think it didn't appear in the mindset of most people. And in fact, the spikes in cholera were a kind of epidemiological mystery for a long time. And it's Martha Alter Chen, who's a fascinating kind of figure in the development world, who is really interested in like women's place in development, who kind of cracks open this case in some ways, and leads epidemiologists to point, and says, in fact, I think that what we're seeing is a shift in the kind of fabric that's being used in filtration, because I've been tracking for years the use of this of thought as filtration. So it is that often the ubiquitous object is the unmarked object, right? And it's only at the moment of failure that you're like, oh, wait, there was something really valuable and important there.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like we see this happening in so many different realms, that the things that are so taken for granted go unseen until, exactly, you pointed out, that moment of failure. We have a question from an audience member, just a kind of practical question, whether it's possible to see the Kramish collection online.
It is, it's not collated in any particular way, but if you actually go to the Philadelphia Museum website and search their collection for Gatha, I think a lot of it is available. There was an extraordinary exhibit put on by Dariel Mason, who's the curator of South Asian art there, probably 10 years ago, in which she brought together not just the extraordinary gathas in the Kramrish collection, but also found all kinds of other seemingly mundane domestic objects that might speak to the shifting form of the gatha. And the one that really struck me when I saw this exhibit was a gold hair comb, you know, the kinds of hair combs that you put in and then like tuck your hair back with. And this gold one had been engraved to say Bande Mataram, which is Hail Motherland. And it was clear that the gatha that had come with the comb was all part of this woman's trousseau who, and the gatha is sort of aged at about 1906, right at the kind of rise of Bengali nationalism and the first partition of Bengal, that this woman came from a nationalist family. And as they married off their daughter, she took a gatha that she made, or probably many gathas that she made, and also this object of nationalist investment. So the exhibit, it was extraordinary. And unfortunately, you can see a lot of these beautiful gathas, but you're going to miss the richer tapestry of a story that it told.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that piece of it. And that actually reminds me of another question that I had about the parallel between nationalism and the revival of specific crafts. I've seen in stories from other times and places how kind of nationalist campaigns co-opt craft for their own ends, often against the odds of, potentially indigenous groups that are not related to the nationalist agenda. We see this happening, that they're co-opted for reasons that are kind of against the better interests of the original makers. Is that quite different from the story that we're seeing here with Katha, or is it similar, or does it kind of depend on who you're talking about more specifically?
It's a complicated answer, partly because I don't want to say that gathas have been co-opted, right? I think that their popularity as commodities within Bangladesh tells a story about desire, right? About what even an urban elite imagines itself wanting, right? And so I don't want to say that those are bad or somehow appropriated gathas. I want to point to the ways in which this form has changed, right? And in changing the form and making it available to new things, new markets, new forms of circulation, you lose something else. You lose something about its intimacy, its tactility too, right? I mean, I'm really always struck by, now you can get them made on silk, on polyester. Everything is new many times. The fabric is not local. Certainly the threads aren't being reused. So they are an entirely different object, still to be valued, but one that has a totally different object life than the gatha that your grandmother stitched for you. Right? These are, so to call them the same thing requires us to hold all of these different pressures together and in abeyance. To think about the forms of representation where women are able to articulate new things. I mean, perhaps a purchasing power made possible by the fair trade model allows for a different form of articulation, right? It's just that you don't see it in the gatha itself.
Yeah, and thank you also for the reminder to all of us about the physicality and human production of the clothing that most of us are probably wearing right now. And we, in the exhibit, when it existed in its physical form, asked visitors to answer some questions on their way into the exhibit, to think about certain things. And one of the things we asked them was to think about their clothing they're wearing right now and where they imagined it coming from. And so many answers had to do with this idea that it had been entirely machine made, which I think is a misconception that so many people have. I want to ask you a couple audience questions that we're having coming in through the chat. And then I see someone with their hand up. So I'll give them a chance to unmute in just a moment. But one question from the audience here in the chat is whether there are ways to teach or learn this art form, especially for the purpose of keeping a multi-generational family practice alive amongst diaspora Bengalis, and where can one learn more about the nature of the post-war handiwork therapy for survivors, and whether this is in your book or elsewhere?
Yes, it is there. I have 2 chapters in my book. The question about where you can learn it, the best answer is a grandmother. I mean, certainly you can teach yourself the running stitch of the gatha, but again, so much of what made these and continues to make these such extraordinary art objects is not that they're individual. They are sites of individual articulation, but these are also collectively and socially formed. They're images and icons that are passed down over generations that friends share. There's a way in which you can tell, if you can learn to read the form of a gatha, you can learn a lot about the social texture of someone's life. So if you wanted to learn to make a gatha, I think you'd have to figure out how to get into the kind of social texture of it. But you would start pretty basically, layers of new cloth between 2 and 8, though I don't recommend starting at 8. I would start maybe at 2. Old cloth and a running stitch. This is all it is. It is incredibly basic in its premise, which is what makes the precision and, I mean, just the sheer beauty of these so astounding, right? That's all it entails, and yet it produces something that's just utterly astounding.
So I'm gonna allow a couple people to unmute here, and you'll see, you should have a notification pop up on your screen that says, asking whether you'd like to unmute. So I'm just gonna unmute the first person here if you'd like to ask your question. Sorry, we can't actually hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, hi, thanks so much for the wonderful talk. I'm not quite sure how to sort of formulate this question, but I was wondering if you could talk about texture as a kind of speech act, right? That transvalues sort of what has been seen as domestic or personal into a kind of politically appreciable act, which is, I think, the words that you used. And I think I was thinking about this because you were talking about how, the occupational therapy became a way for women to share practices, right? That almost defied language in a way, right? And the way in which, so I was just thinking about sort of this idea of texture as a speech act that doesn't necessarily rely on speech, right? But it's also from the throat, right? Insofar as you trace the etymology of kata, right? And so I was wondering if you could sort of maybe riff on that. Thank you.
Absolutely, that's a great question. I think articulation is the term I turn to get away from this question of spoken or written, because articulation is actually a way to think about intention, right? It recognizes that articulations in a variety of forms, a variety of material forms, are meant to be heard, seen, appreciated. We may not always know the full feature of their content, right? We shouldn't presume some sense of mastery that, in looking at a gatha, we can know the inside of a woman's heart. That's not what I'm advocating at all. Instead, I'm suggesting that actually it is about the ways in which these women themselves envisioned their work, right? That they intended their work to be political investment, to be an articulation of their own desires, of their own aspirations, of sometimes maybe their own angers and displeasures, right? Not necessarily that they expected that a grandchild, 40 years later would look at it and be like, oh, that elephant looks angry, right? But rather that these become sites that concatenate meaning, right? And we might seek out certain kinds of meaning in them. And I think that it is looking for that site of the attempt to see or hear what is being articulated. That it's a constant negotiation between ourselves and the technologies of representation before us. I'm going to show you while I have a gatha here. I have several in the house, but this one in particular, this is one of my most treasured objects. This was made by actually the mother of my aunt, and this gatha, at one point we had to repair the edge, and when it was peeled open, it was revealed that there's actually 12 layers of fabric. And you can't tell from here, but it is, maybe 1/8 of an inch thick. It is fabric that is worn down so thin, it's become so soft, and it's lent itself to this remarkable numinous design. And to actually hold and touch a gatha in some ways is when you actually begin to experience its true power. That there's something, to go back to Katie's question, about the tactility, the desire to touch, not just to touch, but to wear, to hold, to actually find yourself encased in this object that gives you a different relationship to it beyond the abstraction. I see 2 more hands, so I won't ramble to give people a chance to ask questions.
Yeah, no, but thank you for showing us that piece, and also for reminding us too. I mean, I think what is so lost, even in a museum context, or particularly in a virtual program like this, is that physical connection with objects that you really can't get other places. I do also want to acknowledge that it's almost 5. Do you have time to take a few other questions?
I'm very happy to.
Great. So there's a few other folks with their hands raised, so I'm going to ask to unmute again, and feel free to ask your question.
Should we take both questions at once and I'll answer them both?
Sure. Yeah. And then we have a couple of questions through the chat, similar questions through the chat.
Great.
You can go ahead.
Hi.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that. Hi, hi, Paulomi. Thank you for your talk. My name is Megha. Ganta is very hard. I've tried it. And what's very difficult actually is the keeping of lines straight, because each small stitch is its own line in a way, and they have their own will in a way. So threading them in a straight fashion is really hard. And I've been thinking a lot myself about lines and kind of structuration of South Asian textiles. And right now I'm not working on textile, I'm working on paper, so I work on law. So there's this idea that the kind of line, it's not sort of this Western line or an originary abstract line, but actually it's a creation of worlds that mirror each other, in the kind of figuration, which then go on to create a type of line in between, different sections of the textile. So it's a very different approach in the sense that the ruler doesn't come first. In fact, the line comes after. So if you think about figuration, I don't know in Kanta actually how it works, but in different other textile forms, and actually paper folding, it has worked that way. So that's one thing, is also the sort of way the shapes arrange themselves and the sequence of those that are, it's significant. And then secondly, my question is, and this is something that I'm just thinking about, so it may feel like a crazy question, which is on draping, and how actually we often stop at the analysis of the textile. It has a mapping and it has a making and a tactility, but it also has another abstract scaffolding, which is the draping of it. And actually very interesting shapes and forms come out even through a draping process. So I feel like that's also connected in some ways to a mapping of something, but I'm not sure what. And I think that these are interesting because they're successive scalarized mappings that fold and unfold. And so I'm wondering, maybe I'm trying to sum it up and say, how can we bring a dimension of movement and layers, or maybe temporality, I'm not sure what you would call it, into this.
Thank you. Nafiza, do you want to ask your question and then I'll try and answer them both?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Katie, for facilitating this, and Paulomi for this wonderful talk. I also work in experiential program design within the museum field, and have been thinking a lot particularly about multi-generational trauma amongst women. As a Bangladeshi American myself, I frequently think about my parents and having lived through the war, and then how that trauma is passed down through generations because it's something that lives within our body. And then how that intersects with these types of traditional arts, and what that could mean for diaspora communities who are still attempting to grapple with challenges in our own families, like the trauma, mental health issues, things that are very much unresolved. And so part of what I've been thinking about doing is figuring out a way to meld the practice of making kata And I asked a question about how to learn how to make kata, because like so many of us who don't live in Bangladesh or, you know, or West Bengal anymore, like we don't have access to elders or grandparents. And it wasn't something that necessarily like even made it to our parents' generation. So yeah, like, do you see a way to connect maybe more of like a contemporary, like mental health practice, or understanding with the art of kata making, which obviously you talked a little bit about in terms of like history and its post-war significance. Yeah, I think that's it. I'll keep it at that for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Those are both great questions. Megha, you know, my answer to the question is actually pretty simple. Those are both really good questions. And it's the question of the body that I am really interested in, particularly textile and its relationship to the body. And that's where draping, the question of lines and form, they happen on the being. And there's nothing, I think, more beautiful or elegant or frankly alchemical than watching a woman put on a sari, right? You can take 9 yards of fabric and you turn it into this extraordinary, and you know, there are hundreds of ways to drape a sari, and you turn it into this thing that is also about the shape and form of the body, how the body wears it. You know, again, to think multi-generationally, the way that older women wear it is very different. The way that like fabric and the body come to inhabit one another, right? This is Peter Stalabras writes so beautifully about the co-constitution of the body and cloth. And he talks about this as worn worlds, that clothing is a worn world. We become the world and the world becomes us through this interaction between textile and the body. So I think that that's where, you know, things come to life. And of course, in a museum, it's impossible. You know, when I was writing this book, a fair amount of the book is tracking the spectral form of taka muslin, which is no longer produced. And you can usually only find it in museums or in private collections. And so I found myself, you know, continuing trying to convince people to let me touch it. So I, you know, would try and convince museum curators to let me touch the fabric. Certainly, you know, private collectors. And I was fixated on getting to touch it. And then, of course, because I'm greedy, I would touch it and then I would touch it in ways that made them incredibly uncomfortable because, of course, they've managed to preserve this fabric for centuries by not letting grubby hands like mine touch it. But it was made to be touched. It was made to be worn. It was made to be used. And so somewhere, you know, and I can see Katie looking a little horrified at the idea of someone coming into a collection and wanting to rub themselves on fabric. But, you know, it is somewhere exactly that which we're not supposed to do, that the fabric invites. And that's, I think, the really exciting, enlivening part of textile, right? Why do we continue to return to it? Why is it this thing that has such a resonance? There's something life-giving about that tactile relationship between our bodies and textile. And Nafisa, it's a wonderful question. I don't have a great answer. I will say one thing, and as a kind of plea instead of an answer, that one of the projects that came out of my book is that I'm putting together a crowdsourced online archive of memories of the war, an attempt to sort of think broadly, democratically, maybe rhizomatically and messily about war and what can be said and cannot be said about the war. I'm collecting recollections, photographs, objects. These will be digitized so you can still keep the originals, and I'm hoping to help develop or be a site for various narratives, sometimes ones that are too messy to fit into clear, you know, categories of history, of counter history. And so that may be one place to think through, not as to think through what might be recalled. And so I would invite anyone who's here who knows of material, wishes to offer material or share it or help help this archive. This is by no means my archive. I'm simply trying to set it up so that it has a life of its own. Please be in touch. I think that we are on the verge of setting up something very interesting. And I would love to figure out how to take the tactile and the textural and the textilic, oh Lord, those are hard words, and bring them together on this totally disembodied digital platform.
Is that something that exists right now, or should I direct people to your email address or elsewhere?
You can direct people to either my website, which has my email address. There is a website. It is right now not live, but it will just direct you to me, and I'm happy to be in touch.
Great. So I'm going to drop the link to your website in the chat right now so that people can get there.
The archive is called It Was 1971.
Okay. Great. I'll try and dig that up. Yeah, and thank you everyone for those wonderful questions that are sparking this great conversation. I do want to say I was not cringing when thinking about you touching things. It's such an interesting conversation that's happening in museums right now about the different ways that we can think about preserving objects that don't mean just one avenue for them to exist forever. And there's actually really fascinating stories about objects in museum collections that are actually deteriorating because of lack of touch, things that really need to move and be so that they don't stiffen and crack and break over time, or these unexpected consequences that come from deciding that everything needs the same treatment. And so hopefully the Hearst Museum will be heading in that direction. I think other museums certainly are ahead of us in that, in thinking about more creative ways to, like, what does it really mean to preserve an object beyond just keeping it in a box and nobody looking at it forever. So I appreciate people's different perspectives on this.
So if you need anyone to come and touch the textiles, I volunteer. I am very happy to come and do that.
Great. I will let our conservator know and see what she might have a very different answer than I do to this question. I'm trying to Google It Was 1971 and pull it up here, and it's
you can just go to my personal website, which is myname.com.
Perfect. Drop that in there and people should be able to find it. Great. So we just because we're about 10 after, I think we had a few more questions in the chat here. Maybe I can pose them to you and we can decide if we want to do this now. That was just kind of briefly asking, and maybe we can refer people to your book about this. Some questions about 10,000 villages, similar groups, other places that people are familiar with, being able to buy, these kind of artisan crafts, and whether you can say anything more about that. And then one question also about whether the occupational therapy and was purely therapy in the form of like doing a craft, or whether there was also opportunities for people to explore their experiences and pain through like the actual content production itself, or whether the therapy was more indirect healing.
I can answer the second one, which was that, the way that the rehabilitation centers were set up is that they were largely volunteers. And I think what I described as occupational therapy really came by way of mostly women trying to figure out how to help these women who had come into their care. And I don't think that there was clearly not like a program in that way. Certainly they had, medical support. They tried to get women to talk about their experiences, but many of them found the most productive way forward was just let women re-inhabit the mundane practices of life. And then there's, of course, this deep drive towards economic productivity. And that's what moves us into not just the handicraft industry, but clerical training, technological training. There's a really interesting precursor then to the garments work that I trace in my book. Because you see that this emergent state recognizes there's going to be various demands placed on it, and that women are going to be significant to its economic future. So that the economic part, it really in some ways takes pride of place, especially in the kind of purported success of the rehabilitation efforts. And the other question was about 10,000 villages. there's again, you can take a look at the book, but it is not that I don't want to tell you not to shop at 10,000 Villages. Is the fair trade model better than an unfair trade model? Yes, absolutely. I'm simply trying to get us to be aware of what we think, the alibi we think we give ourselves when we purchase fair trade. The ways in which this neoliberal sense of purchasing the life that you might wish they live, which looks like yours, right? Buy the change you wish to be in the world. This is, I think, the insidious part of the fair trade, that alibis become a way for us to justify consumer practices and not think about where those consumer practices falter, say, in ready-made garments work. What would happen if we thought of our H&M t-shirts with the same questions of beauty and the individual manufacturer and uplift as we do with, the, Be Brave pillow from 10,000 Villages. You would say that the whole thing falls apart because then you couldn't buy a t-shirt for $6, right? So you can have your $65 dog pillow and your $6 t-shirt, but you have to hold these two in entirely different aesthetic economies in order to do so. And those come out of the kind of affective economy of whether or not you are doing good by buying. And this is a whole conversation also about fast fashion, which I know many people are having right now, but that's what I will say.
Thank you for that. And hopefully that can give some people some food for thought going into the holiday season here. Well, with that, I'd just love to say thank you again so much for this fabulous presentation. Thank you all for joining us this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And yeah, leave it with that. Hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.